And this is unfortunately our last session with Professor Whish, at least for this year. Hopefully for the next one, we're going to have him live, which is much more pleasant, particularly when we go out for wines and we can chat freely with him. So I think we missed that. But Professor, once again, we thank you for making yourself available to share your thoughts with us in Brazil. We value very much everything you can teach us, and all the summary you are so able to do in such a way that we can digest that very efficiently from our side. If we were to resume, if we were to actually by ourselves review and take care of this case, we're probably going to spend the whole year doing that. So you've bring to us what I think is most essential of these cases, and that's what's so fascinating about this classes. So thanks again, and you have the floor, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bruno. Nice to be with you all again. There are lots of faces on this screen that I recognise, and I haven't said hello to you all individually, but you know, the ones that know that I know you know that I know you, and it's very nice to see you. Anyway, now look, for today, to be perfectly honest, I do not have a great amount of material because I've done all the 101 stuff in the first lecture. We did 102 last lecture, and there are just a few bits and pieces for today. So there are a few things I'll talk about, but there's not a lot of hard law. So it may well be that in terms of presentation, it's kind of 20 minutes, half an hour. But I am very happy to take any kind of questions that you have about anything at the end. So why don't I do the presentation and then ask me the questions, okay? So I got to page 11 of the handout. That's to say, I finished 10 on Article 102. Then you've got this section called Practice and Procedure at EU level. So that's a section of this handout where things that don't fit in anywhere else I put into this section. And often it's about cases that go to the Court of Justice on points of procedure and so on. On page 11, the only case I thought I would say something about is Otis and Land Oberösterreich, because this is an example of how incredibly keen we are now in Europe to promote damages claims when there has been anti-competitive conduct. I'm not fully aware of quite how many damages actions there are in Brazil, but this is really, 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 really big business now in the EU, and any major cartel, any cartel decision of the European Commission will inevitably lead to follow-on actions for damages. And you'll know that we've had the damages directive in the EU, which to some extent has harmonized the rules across the EU for bringing damages claims. And essentially what the damages directive did was to upgrade national systems of law to make it easier for people to bring damages claims. Now, this particular case, Otis and Land Oberösterreich, so Land Oberösterreich, that is, as it were, a province of Austria, Upper Austria, Oberösterreich. And Otis was in the elevator and escalator cartel. So that was a major, major cartel decision quite a long time ago now. Wow, probably 8-9 years ago. And of course, buildings, railway stations, offices, etc., lots of elevators, lots of escalators. And so there's been damages claims all around the EU. But what quite often happens when you bring the damages claim is that you claim that you have suffered economic harm, and for one reason or another, the local law, I mean, these actions will be brought in tort or delict. I don't know what you call it in the Brazilian system. In England, it's a tort. In Roman systems, often it's a delict. But you bring the action and you find that for some reason, the local applicable law does not provide a remedy. And then very often a claimant will appeal against the non-award of damages, saying, by not compensating us, this is failing effectively to apply competition law, because competition law is enforced through public infringement decisions. It's enforced by imposing fines, but another part of the deterrent mechanism for enforcing competition law is that victims can be compensated for their harm. And so if, for some reason, a national law does not provide compensation, you claim that this is the ineffective enforcement of competition law. There is a doctrine in EU law, in French, it's the effet utile doctrine. We translate that as to full effectiveness in English. You've got to give full effect to competition law. Now, in this case, you've got the elevator and escalator cartel. Obviously, if you're a development company and you pay inflated prices for elevators and escalators, obviously you've got a damages claim. But what is going on in Upper Austria is that you've got the province, the state, and the state lends money to property developers to enable them to build apartment blocks for the inhabitants. And in this case, Upper Austria lends money at below market interest rates. So let's say at the relevant time, the prevailing interest rate is 3%. They lend the money at 2% to help the developer develop the property. And they discover that there is an elevator cartel. And because there was an elevator cartel, the developers were paying more for lifts. And so they had to borrow more. And so we have lent money to the developer at below market interest rates, but we now realize that we lent more than we would have done if there was no cartel. So we lent 2 million euros, and we should really only have lent 1.5 million euros. That means we lent 500,000 euros that we shouldn't have done at 2%. If we had kept that money, we could have had it on deposit in a bank account at 3%. Therefore, the cartel has cost us the interest that we would have earned on the 500,000 euros which we had lent because of the cartel. And Austrian tort law says, look, it may be a plausible story, but our system of competition law our system of compensation law does not award damages as remote, as we would say in English law, from the wrongdoing. So Austrian law provides no remedy. And Otis appeals that up to the Austrian Supreme Court, and the Austrian Supreme Court says to the Court of Justice, help, what is the answer? Clearly, they've suffered financial loss, but clearly Austrian law does not award damages in these circumstances. And the Court of Justice says the priority of competition law is to ensure that Article 101 is effectively enforced. Part of enforcement is ensuring adequate compensation. You, Austria, are not adequately compensating, and so the doctrine of effet utile gives a remedy, that national law would not have given. Now, just as a lawyer, I find that completely fascinating, and it's one of about 10 cases of that nature where there was no remedy in national law, but EU law, as a matter of public policy, says we've got to properly compensate because we've got to properly enforce. So I think it's a very interesting one. And as I said at the start, nowadays, damages claims, they're absolutely everywhere. And you can have something like the trucks cartel, where the fines were about 4 million euros, but some people have suggested that the damages that will follow might be as much as 100 billion euros. So actually, the damages bit of it becomes infinitely more significant than the fining bit of it. But then, of course, that massively adds to the deterrence effect of competition law. Okay, so there we are. That's that one. If you've got any questions about damages for later, it's one of my favourite topics. I'm very happy talking about it. On page 12, I just list here lots of initiatives of the European Commission. And there were 5 I wanted to draw your attention to. The way our system happens in Europe is that somebody is appointed as commissioner for a period of 4 years. And as you know, for the last 4 years, the commissioner has been Margrethe Vestager. And last year, she was appointed for another 4-year term. And she's a massively influential figure. She's very, very courageous. She is a politician and sort of knows how to stand up to vested interests and so on. And she's been appointed for another 4-year term. And she has now embarked on the most incredibly ambitious program of things to be achieved under her second mandate. And I've listed some of them, not all of them, but some of them are listed here. So the first one is the new competition tool. And I imagine you've read about this or you know something about it. But I did think it might be interesting if I just explained it in a little bit more depth. Why would the Commission want a new competition tool? Now, this goes to the question of the digital platforms. So everyone in the world, of course, nowadays is talking about GAFAM, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft. Are they too powerful? Do they need to be regulated? Do they need to be broken up? I mean, every authority everywhere in the world is talking about this, and countries are adopting legislation. I saw something this morning that the state of New York is thinking of introducing some sort of new abuse provision to deal with the platforms. Anyway, in Europe, we've had all those cases I was talking about last week. We've got 2 Apple cases, we've had 3 Google cases, we've got an Amazon case, the BKA has done Facebook. So there's a lot of, if you like, conventional antitrust enforcement. Separately, the Kramer report to the Commission suggested other things that might be necessary to deal with certain problems in the digital platform space. And so the Commission, in June of this year, proposed a package of measures. And one part of the package would be a Digital Services Act, and that would deal with all sorts of aspects of digital markets. Secondly, was the suggestion that there might have to be some ex ante regulation of some digital platforms. And so there might be rules imposed on platforms about data sharing or data portability, or not leveraging power in one market into a neighbouring market. And I think, quite frankly, that there will in due course be some kind of system of ex ante regulation. Just as in Europe, some of you will know, we have the competition rules that apply to the telecommunications sector, but there's also a telecommunications framework directive whereby certain undertakings are identified as having significant market power in particular markets, and then the national telecoms regulators are obliged to impose ex ante regulatory rules, non-discrimination, access, etc. So I think there will be an ex ante directive adopted. But the Commission then says, and there's something else that we think we might like to have, and that is a new competition tool, something over and above Articles 101 and 102. What do we mean? What would this tool look like? Answer, it would look like the UK Enterprise Act of 2002. And that piece of legislation contains something which is almost unique, not quite, I'll come back to that, but it's almost unique, which says that in certain circumstances, our competition authority, if it looks at a market where there appears to be a market failure, there's a lack of effective competition, the CMA can launch a market investigation. And this investigation lasts up to 18 months. It can be extended to 2 years. And what the CMA does is to look at the market and ask itself, are there any features of this market that have an adverse effect on competition? If it discovers features of the market that have an adverse effect on competition, then it can impose remedies to overcome those features. So this means that you look at the market, you're not trying to find an agreement that infringes 101. You're not trying to look for abusive conduct on the part of a dominant firm. You're looking holistically at the market. And if you find features of it that are harmful to consumers, you can impose remedies. Those remedies up to and including imposing divestitures. So the most famous market investigation case we had in the UK was an investigation of UK airports. And there was one company, British Airports Authority, that owned Heathrow Airport, Stansted Airport in London, and Gatwick Airport in London. It also in Scotland owned Glasgow Airport and Edinburgh Airport. And the CMA looked at the UK airports market and came to the conclusion that an obvious feature of the airport sector in the UK was a total monopoly of airports in the London area, and also, frankly, Edinburgh, Glasgow, they're not very far apart in Scotland, so you had a kind of a monopoly in the centre of Scotland. And so British Airports Authority was ordered to divest itself of Gatwick Airport, Stansted Airport, and Edinburgh Airport, and that did happen. Now, just to make the point, in that situation, there's no finding of wrongdoing. Nobody's being accused of anything. Nobody's going to be fined. Nobody's going to be sued for damages. But on the other hand, there's a kind of a nuclear weapon here, because you actually do order somebody to divest themselves of assets in circumstances where they have not committed any wrongdoing. So it's a very interesting tool. It can be an extremely powerful tool. And of course, it's controversial because it does involve, if you like, the expropriation of assets where you haven't done anything wrong. And when British Airports Authority appealed against the decision to the Competition Appeal Tribunal, Nick Green, the barrister for British Airports Authority, began his speech by saying, This is the biggest expropriation of property by the British state since Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 16th century, which is quite a good line, but of course he still lost the case. I say it's almost unique. There are 4 other systems in the world with something like this. Greece, Iceland, Mexico, and South Africa. Each of those legal systems does contain something like this. The Mexican one is very interesting, where it is possible to look at basically essential facilities, and in certain circumstances there is a power to do something about the essential facility. This all came about because of telecommunications in Brazil, and the feeling that the conventional tools of competition law were inadequate to address it all. So that is what the Commission means by a new competition tool. They went out to consultation in June. The consultation period has ended, and they will table their proposals probably in December of this year. And you can imagine people over here are immensely excited about this. You can also imagine that many people are vastly, hugely opposed to it, because it can involve divestiture with no wrongdoing, and procedurally, how would it work? Who would make the decision? How do you deal with confirmation bias? Would there be a judicial review, or would it be an appeal on the merits? All very contentious, but let's wait and see what happens. I just yesterday submitted a report that they asked me to write on the UK MIR, Market Investigation Reference System, and on other analogous provisions. So that's how I know about Greece, Iceland, Mexico and South Africa, because I've been studying them very intensively over the last couple of months. So that might be something you want to ask me about later on. Then the next thing that the Commission is doing is consulting on market definition. And this is hugely interesting, much more technical, of course, in a sense. You all know our SNP notice of 1997. How do you define a market? Well, you hypothesize a small but non-significant increase in price in the region of 5 to 10%, and you ask yourselves, in those circumstances, would I divert from widgets to blodgets? Would I divert from holidaying in the Caribbean to holidaying in Southeast Asia? Now, the SNP notice, it's all very interesting, and it sets out a conceptual methodology for thinking about markets. But the world of 1997 is very different from the world of 2000. And over the intervening 23 years, huge amounts have been discovered about market definition. It's become quite clear that for some markets, the SNP notice doesn't really have an easy application at all. How do you apply the SNP test to two-sided and multi-sided markets? How do you deal with a market in which on one side of the market I use Google free? So how can you apply a SNP test to the price of my using Google in circumstances in which I don't pay anything to use Google anyway? If you apply a 5 to 10% increase to naught, I was never very good at maths, but I'm sure that 10% of naught is still naught. So as a test, it's meaningless. So maybe you have to think about different things, like a small but significant decrease in the standards of privacy. And if Facebook were to decrease my privacy standards, might I then switch to a different social media platform? And so essentially what the Commission is saying is we're 23 years down the line maybe we need to rethink this or update the guidance. And I mean, let's face it, we do. That's not to criticize the notice. It's just that all of us, I mean, my God, we're infinitely more sophisticated than we were 23 years ago. I was lecturing somebody else this morning, a big international company, and telling them about a time in 1994 when I chaired a conference in Brussels, one of the annual Informa conferences in Brussels, and the Commission had just tabled a draft of the SNP notice, requiring lawyers to hypothesize a 5 to 10% increase in the price of widgets. And I chaired a panel of economists who were explaining the SNP test to this room of 150 lawyers. And people were kind of fainting and being carried out of the room on stretchers because it's not the sort of thing that lawyers do. It's not fair, it's not right. And there was massive opposition to the SNP test and to having a market share test in the block exemption for vertical agreements. Whereas nowadays in 2020, we all, I hope, are absolutely comfortable with the principles of these things. We may sometimes need to enlist the help of economists to help us to crunch the data to come up with sensible answers, but we understand the principles. But there's so much additional learning, and somehow the Commission needs to capture that and give us fresh guidance. If and when they do it, it'll be a public good that competition lawyers and economists the world over will be able to make use of. So that's that. Then you've got this initiative on collective bargaining. This is a really interesting one. I mean, it's a good legal question. It used to be common in industry that you would have thousands of employees who would be represented by trades unions, and then you'd have employers' organizations, and then typically you would have collective bargaining in the metal workers industry or in the coal mining industry, and there would be an agreement about wages, terms, conditions, and then that's just applied in that sector. Well, of course, an agreement of that kind could have a hugely distortive effect on competition, quite clearly. But the attitude, eventually a case went to the Court of Justice about collective bargaining called Albany International. It was in about 1999. And the question for the Court of Justice is a collective agreement of this kind between management and labour, is it subject to competition law? Because it's certainly an agreement and it's certainly distorting competition, but is it subject to Article 101? And the Court of Justice said, you know, that's a very interesting question. And this is one of those occasions where you've got a competition policy here in the treaty, and competition is important. And you've got another policy in the treaty, which is to promote social cohesion. I mean, that's articulated as a EU policy. And social cohesion is helped by sensible collective bargaining. And it's a way of overcoming strikes and getting decent wages for the workforce and whatever. So you've got these two policies in conflict with one another. We, the Court of Justice, have got to decide, does competition policy override social cohesion, or does social cohesion override competition policy? And the Court of Justice said social cohesion is more important. Therefore, this kind of collective wage bargaining is not subject to competition law. So it's just been kind of written out of the Article 101 story. And quite a lot of national competition laws I've seen over the years have explicitly said agreements related to terms and conditions of employment are outside competition law scrutiny. But we then look at the economy of 2020, when, I mean, a lot of employees are 0-hour employees, I don't know if you have those in Brazil, but in the UK, Europe, lots of people just have 0-hour contracts where they're contracted to somebody and yet they're not guaranteed any work. I mean, what the hell is going on there? But then you've also got people like, say, the Uber model, where the Uber drivers are actually self-employed individuals, which means that for competition law purposes, in the language of Article 101, they are undertakings. So suppose all the Uber drivers in London get together and say, Uber just isn't paying us a fair rate. We're only getting paid X pence per mile. Let us agree not to supply our services to Uber unless they pay us Y pence per mile. As I see it, that is a price fixing agreement between undertakings. It's an agreement to raise the price of the service you supply. Well, in that case, Uber drivers trying to get better terms and conditions out of Uber cartelize the market and are liable as individuals to be fined for price fixing. Is that really where we want to be? Or is this one of these situations where the nice old social democratic model of the 90s, when you had employees, trades unions, etc., that's yesterday's world. In today's world, it's a much harsher environment, and people who once had protections no longer have protections. And the Commission says, well, we really need to look at this. And so they launched a process on it in June of this year. I'm entirely sympathetic to the idea that gig workers, etc., should be able to combine to protect themselves. But as a matter of competition law, I'm not sure quite how you get there. So it's a very fascinating one, and I don't also know what to expect. And then, while the Commission is looking at digital platforms, ex-ante regulation, new competition tool, did a recent market sector study on e-commerce, it now says we need to have a look at the Internet of Things. So you all know what the Internet of Things is. It's that fridge downstairs that realizes I've run out of frozen peas and orders Waitrose to deliver something for me. So we live in a world where we never have to think for ourselves because all our gadgets do it for us, and it's because everything is connected. The connected car. So my car's got brake pads that are deficient, and the manufacturer in Stuttgart is told that there's a Volkswagen car with bad brake pads, and somehow the car gets repaired, all through interconnectivity. Well, brilliant, amazing, how clever, but there must be competition issues in all of this. Data, aggregation of data, there are platforms, these kind of markets can tip. Do we, the Commission, understand the Internet of Things, or do we need to do a market study? So that is what they're doing, just as our CMA has just done a market study of online advertising, digital platforms and online advertising. And I'm sure Kaji does these market studies as well. Sometimes you have to start by just understanding what's going on, including technically understanding the market for what's going on. And then hopefully you can begin to identify the issues that might need regulation or might need competition law intervention or whatever. So, I mean, it's a fascinating exercise, as I say, report in the summer of 2022. And then the last thing is the Commission is in the process of reforming our vertical agreement block exemption. So you know that where you have a vertical agreement in EU, there's a block exemption, and as long as your market share is below 30%, and provided you do not have certain hardcore blacklisted provisions, the agreement is basically okay. But that regulation is from 2010. And of course, again, the world has moved on massively since then. And so much commerce has now gravitated to the online world and away from the bricks and mortar world, because there is a sense that that block exemption, with its corresponding vertical guidelines, it was all written very much with a bricks and mortar world in mind. But even without the pandemic, we were moving away from the bricks and mortar world. And with the pandemic, I mean, the amount of e-commerce now is phenomenal. So what has happened there is there's been a consultation. And a lot of you will be interested in vertical agreements. They did the consultation, and 3 weeks ago, they published the staff working document. So that document, I think it's about 250 pages, if I remember, in which the commission, the team in DG Comp, have looked at every conceivable aspect of vertical agreements, and the kind of restrictions you get, and the price parity clauses and the non-price parity clauses, and the restrictions on online discounting. I mean, vast amount of information, and it's all in that document. It's a really wonderful piece of work. It's a fabulous resource. It's on DG Comp's website. What they now will do is to table their proposals, and I think they're intending to publish them this autumn. There will then be a consultation on the proposals, and that would end next spring, early summer, and then they will adopt, I assume they will adopt a new block exemption, and they will certainly write new vertical guidelines, and then that all has to come into force by the 1st of June 2022, because that's when the existing block exemption expires. So a new regime for the 1st of June 2022 sounds quite a long time away, but really it isn't. I've been through these block exemptions numerous times in the past, and they have a way of very rapidly overtaking things, so be aware of it. Now, I'm more or less finished now, because page 14 won't be of interest to you. It's just a list of pending cases in Luxembourg. Page 15 is just a list of the various things that the Commission and the ECN and the ICN did around COVID. And page 17, 18, 19, EU merger control. Not really got terribly much to say about merger control, because, of course, when it comes to it, these mergers are about the economic analysis. There's not that much law as such. So there's a table of phase 2 cases on page 17, but I don't really have anything to say about them. Boeing, Embraer, very interesting, but Commission never had to make a decision there because the parties abandoned the merger. I dare say some of you would have been involved. Page 18, just 2 cases to mention on page 18 because they are interesting. First one, CK Telecoms against the Commission. Now that was a mobile merger where Hutchison was proposing to acquire O2, so that was 2 mobile operators on the UK market merging. So in the jargon of merger control, this was a 4-3 case. There are 4 players, there would have been 3. And some of you will know that the merger regulation was changed in 2004 to give the Commission jurisdiction over what was called the gap. Because the old merger reg applied to the creation of single firm dominance. It also applied to the strengthening, the creation of collective dominance, meaning, if you like, coordinated effects in a market. But the old reg required dominance. But then people increasingly said, you know, you can have a 4-3 merger, or even more so, a 3-2 merger, where post-merger, the merged entity will not be individually dominant, nor is it the kind of market where you get coordinated effects. So there won't be any collective dominance, but even so, post-merger, the merged entity will have more market power than it had pre-merger, because you are removing some competitive constraint from the market. So this was said to be a gap. So the merger regulation was changed so that instead of the test being the creation or strengthening of dominance, the test became a significant impediment to effective competition. So some gap cases could now be caught if you could show a significant impediment to effective competition. So that test was introduced in 2004, and the Commission has sometimes intervened in 4-3 and 3-2 cases. In the case of Hutchison 02, they actually prohibited the merger. And it's a great case because for the first time in history, Hutchison appealed to the General Court. So CK Telecoms is Hutchison. The first gap case to go to the court, and the court says, Commission, you got it wrong. Your analysis isn't good enough. The standard of proof is more than balance of probabilities. You have to show convincingly that there would be an SIEC. And if you're saying this involved the elimination of a competitor, because it did, it's 4-3, it's not just to say it's the elimination of a competitor. You've got to show it's the elimination of a real competitor that was exercising a positive competitive constraint, and you have failed to do that. So a big defeat, the first gap case to be appealed, and the Commission has lost it. But the interesting thing is the Commission is appealing that to the Court of Justice, saying in particular that the General Court set too high a standard in terms of proof, a higher standard than is the correct one. So the Commission says there's an error of law here. And I must say, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I can imagine the Commission winning the legal point, although the court might still say, on the facts of the case, you got it wrong. So it's a very, very important moment in time. We've just got to wait and see. The other case in my handout is a gun jumping case where MOE, some of you will have seen a decision of the Commission called Marine Harvest. They've now changed their name to MOE, and they acquired a significant minority holding in a company through share acquisitions. And the Commission said they bought, I think they got up to 49% of the shares of the target in circumstances where that was infinitely larger as a shareholding than anybody else. And so the Commission says, at a point in time, you de facto acquired control, but you didn't notify. And so we're going to fine you for gun jumping. But we're going to fine you twice, because one, Article 4 of the merger regulation has an infringement of failure to notify. Article 7 of the regulation has an offence of completing a merger before clearance. And so the Commission says you've committed 2 infringements. And MOE argue we can't be fined twice Because if we failed to notify and completed, of course we've infringed 4 and 7. But the one is included in the other. As it were, 4 is subsumed within 7. So we can't be fined twice. And the Court of Justice says, oh, yes, you can, because these are separate infringements. You could notify a merger, so you haven't infringed 4, but you might then complete it without clearance, so then you've infringed 7. So 4 and 7 have separate spheres of application, and so you can be fined twice. And so that's what's happened. So there we are. I have got nothing more to say, except perhaps in 2 sentences. One, apart from merge control, the Commission is looking into this question: should there be an additional layer of control over foreign inward investment? The merger reg is used to look at the effect on competition, but do we want, let's face it, the Chinese acquiring our IT companies, our ports, our airports, significant strategic infrastructure? I think that something is on the way here. There will be an instrument, and member states, national sovereign states, are looking more into that. The other question is the whole killer acquisition debate. Facebook acquired WhatsApp, but it wasn't subject to the merger regulation because WhatsApp didn't have sufficient turnover. It's a startup, but to fall within the merger reg, you have to have 250 million euros of turnover. Query, is this a serious gap? And does something need to be done about it? So that's very much an ongoing debate. So look, that's it in terms of material. I see that there are some questions here. I'm just quietly reading the questions, okay, and then I'll be with you. Significant increase in damages claims in Europe after changes in sentence. What advice would I give to you to foment this type of case? Don't charge fees, just do it pro bono. That's my answer to that. No, I'll come back. And then Daniel and the leniency thing. Now then, the first thing, how do you actually promote damages claims? And it is a really good question. Now, I told you that we had the directive, and the directive tries to make sure that member states have sensible rules in place that make it possible to bring damages claims. One of the legal systems differ hugely, and if you're a claimant seeking damages, then you have to have access to lots of information. How much did the widgets cost? What's in the invoices? What's the cost of the inputs and the outputs and whatever? I mean, these cases are massively data and evidence driven. You'll know that in the English and Welsh legal system, we have very generous rules on disclosure. So a claimant can go to the court and say, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. And our courts have the power to order disclosure. Lots of continental systems, maybe your system, is very different from that. And there aren't the same disclosure opportunities. And so one of the things that the directive does is to require legal systems to have mechanisms for making the necessary information available. And some member states, even without the directive, had started to change their law because there is now quite literally competition between states to attract damages claims. One of the things I've done in my life is quite often to train judges of national systems about damages claims. And I can remember once being at the European University Institute in Florence, and there was a room of judges from 25 different member states. And talking to the Dutch and the German judges And they were telling me how they were changing Dutch and German law to try to divert some of the claims currently brought in London to Germany and the Netherlands. And that included changing their disclosure rules, also allowing, I mean, this is amazing, you can bring an action in the Netherlands and Germany now for damages in the English language, because the courts have actually changed the court rules to allow the actions to be brought in English, because it's another way of attracting the litigation. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing you have to do is to have law firms who know how to act for claimants. And this is a really interesting thing, because, you know, I go to law firms like Freshfields and Clifford Chance and Linklaters giving my lectures. Well, to be honest, these are the law firms that act for the big defendants in the cartel cases. And they have litigation departments. And so within Freshfields now, there's a huge team of people in the competition group who only do damages claims. They don't do merger filings and stuff like that. They just defend the actions, but they do defend the actions because typically the clients are the defendants. Well, the old saying in the Midwest in the 19th century was there was no point in being the only lawyer in town. Because if you're going to defend someone, you need someone to attack me. And so really, every lawyer's interest is in there being a plaintiff law firm. And I'm absolutely serious about this. So in London now, you've got Housefeld, Quinn Emanuel, Scott and Scott. I look at all of the actions that are brought in the High Court or the Competition Appeal Tribunal, who is acting. And on the claimant side, it's 3 or 4 firms, the same firms all the time, and they know how to do it. They know how to run these claims, and there's enormous expertise involved in it. Another thing is, how are you going to fund the action? Because, of course, these things are vastly, vastly expensive. And so in a Darwinian kind of way, the European market has changed as funders of litigation have entered the market and they look at the merits of a case and then they are prepared in certain circumstances to fund it. You can get insurance against the possibility of being asked to pay the other side's costs. So there's a whole funding story there as well. And then another thing you need is judges who can do it. Because in different legal systems, you have judges with different abilities. And if these things just go to the kind of court that one day is doing a medical negligence case and the next day is doing a suspension bridge fell down because of faulty design, and the next case we're doing damages quantification in the trucks cartel, I mean, oh my God, you know, these things are enormously different. So there is a question of whether you can develop judicial expertise in these kind of things. And it has to be said now in London and the Netherlands and Germany and incidentally Spain, lots of actions happening there where the judges, you can have judges assigned to, as it were, the competition bench. And that helps the system as well. So there are lots of different things going on. I'm sure there are 5 others I haven't thought to mention. So I'm now going back to the questions. I'll go for the damages ones, and then I'll come back to the other. I just realised on damages I didn't mention Daniel's point there being what about leniency? And this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because if I blew the whistle and avoided a €1 billion fine, but then expose myself to joint and several liability for 100 billion euros of damages, I'm not sure how incentivized I am to blow the whistle. And I think we all know there is an issue here. So what our directive has done has been to say, if you are the whistleblower, you're only liable for the harm you have inflicted. You're not jointly and civilly liable for all the harm that the cartel has inflicted, unless there are no other defendants. So even that is a conditional limitation. But a question is, should you immunize the whistleblower from damages? And the Commission looked at that at the time of the directive, and it's just not possible as a matter of law. You've got 28 national systems, you've got constitutions that guarantee rights to compensation. Well, you know, if it's a two-firm cartel, I blew the whistle and the other one's gone out of business, there's only one person left that can compensate, and that's me, the whistleblower. As you know, in the States, you're not liable to treble damages, you're only liable to single damages. So one question in Europe was whether we should, in the directive, treble the damages and then de-treble them for the whistleblower. But then lots of constitutions in Europe don't allow punitive damages, so that couldn't be done as a matter of law. So there is a problem here. Not got an answer to it, quite frankly. Then we go in a different direction, foreign investment screening. Oh, go on.
Just still on the damage, before we move on. I don't know if you're aware, but we have a proposal to change our law here, which is solving some issues on statutory limitation. We're creating double damage incentives. We are excluding not only the lenient, but also the settling parties, the ones that do an agreement with CADI for solving the investigation. We're excluding them from joint liability for the damage. So it's a bit inspired in Europe and the US. Of course, CADI is very protective of the lenient documents, and I think you mentioned very, very important points here that we have to take into account. But one question, I have two questions. The first one is, what about arbitration? Because in our law project here, there is an incentive that was created when the company decides to settle with CADI. One of the elements that it needs to agree is to go to arbitration with someone that actually wishes to repair or wishes to have his damage repaired afterwards. So it is agreeing beforehand to go to arbitration afterwards if necessary. And we think this may give additional incentives because, as you know, our judiciary system is so locked up that it sometimes takes 30 years for you to get a final decision. So that's one point. And the second question is related to those attempts from some law firms to actually consolidate the damage claims globally or European in the UK courts. Last time I heard they were not being very successful on that, but I don't know how that has evolved, if it has.
On leniency, you reminded me of what I intended to say, and I know you know the answer to this, that there are provisions in the directive that are intended to protect the leniency applicant in the sense that it went to the authority and said everything, so it has exposed itself to damages, obviously, because the cartel is going to be caught and then there'll be a follow-on claim. But what we don't want is to get to a situation where, by exposing yourself, you make yourself more vulnerable to damages than everybody else, because that would be completely ridiculous. And so that's why there are rules in the directive that require the national court not to disclose the actual leniency document. And that is to make sure that the leniency applicant isn't put at a worse position than everyone else. Of course, it can be in the same position, but it most certainly should not be in a worse position. The arbitration thing, I mean, that's interesting. And I think you're talking about the utility of arbitration in a Brazilian context, where I think what you're suggesting is you don't really think that these are the right kind of things to be handled by the courts, and so let's have them handled by arbitrators instead. Look, I mean, that's the first time I've heard that point, but my instinctive reaction is it sounds very sensible, because I'm assuming that probably you're going to have an arbitrator appointed by one side, an arbitrator appointed by the other side, and a third arbitrator appointed by whatever the arbitral body might be. And I have appeared as expert witness in arbitrations. And frankly, I've just always been very impressed at the quality of the arbitrators, who very often are retired judges or whatever it might be. And I felt that they were, a highly qualified panel. So that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. And if it's a way of sort of dealing with, if you like, institutional defects in Brazil, because that's kind of what we're saying, may be very good. And of course, the arbitrators presumably can be from other jurisdictions who have experience in competition and damages claims. So that does make a lot of sense. Consolidation of claims. What I have noticed a few times, and this is just by chatting to firms or maybe watching MLEX and PAR, is that when you're dealing with one of these global cartels, refrigerator compressors or maritime car carriers or whatever, obviously there are potentially claimants in, well, literally 100 different jurisdictions conceivably. And I can see that from a defendant point of view, a kind of a global settlement would be much more attractive than, now let's move on to the claim in Fiji, and then we'll do Vanuatu next week and the Solomon Islands the week after. I mean, oh my God. And I have heard of cases where somehow all the relevant protagonists have been brought together, and a global deal has been done. That's different, obviously, from the juridical question of whether you can consolidate claims, and that's different. Different rules of procedure will have different answers to that. I mean, one of the things is, you've got these people like cartel damages claims who basically buy people's claims and then sue on behalf of all the causes of action that they have acquired. But in some legal systems, that is contrary to public policy, because it amounts to speculation in the outcome of litigation, making a profit from it. So, that's all kind of quite complicated stuff. Then there's a question about foreign investment screening. Is this specifically openly or not targeted against China? Well, I'm pretty sure the legislation won't say that. But is it? Yes, it is. Oh, that's being recorded. No, I didn't say that. I don't know. It is possible. It would be interesting to hear more on my views on the apparent intention of the EU to force big tech companies to share data or prohibit them from preferential treatment. I haven't seen the FT today, but I mean, look, how would I answer that? It's very easy to use expressions like big data and data portability and whatever, as though there are simple answers, just as there are politicians who say we have to regulate platforms. But of course it's ridiculous, isn't it? Because it's which platforms, doing what, which data, is data portable, should there be an access right? And I just don't think there are any single answers to this. I just think that all of us are just embarked upon this journey of trying to work out what's the right, first of all, what's the question, and then having identified the question, what's the answer to that question. So I'm not going to suggest that there's some kind of simple solution to this. I do think that for the most part, competition authorities do not believe that divestiture has much of a role, if any, to play in this. Because, of course, the development of whatever the product might be, that is part of the innovation. And, this amazing thing that I have in my hand here, are we really going to say, don't include a camera, don't include an app store, don't include, what else have I got here? Don't enable me to watch the football on BT Sport? It's ridiculous. So the idea you've got to divest yourself of all of these things undermines the very efficiencies that we all benefit from. Divestiture can be a remedy to something like the British Airports Authority, because the problem in that case is it's airports and they were state-owned, and when the government privatised the airports, it wanted to get the most money it possibly could. Well, how do you get the most money you can? By selling a legal public monopoly into the private sector. People will pay a lot of money for that. And then 20 years later, the Competition Authority says, yes, but this monopoly, it's ridiculous. And there is an obvious remedy of divestiture in a case like that. But in a sense, it was to heal what was a bad privatization in the first place. So I doubt very much that divestiture will be part of the answer. I do think that certain platforms being told that they can't self-preference, I absolutely do see that. But then it's a question of which platforms, because different platforms do hugely different things. Then there's the question, can I comment more specifically on the Commission's proposal? Oh, on subsidies. I can't comment specifically on those proposals, because, to be perfectly honest, I haven't read the proposals. But just so that people understand what the issue is, within the EU, we, or nowadays I have to say they, have very strong rules on state aid. And one of the reasons why the UK may not do a deal with the EU is that the EU is saying, if you want access to our internal market, you've got to have state aid rules that make sure that there is a level playing field. Because as of the 1st of January, we are a third country. And I can absolutely see, if you're having lots of acquisitions in the EU, or lots of behaviour going on in the EU, and the behaviour in question is being funded by Chinese investment or Chinese loans, I mean, logically, I can absolutely see why the Commission would say we need some sort of instrument to deal with that. But I do not know the detail of it. I did see something the other day that China is reacting violently against the idea. So now we are into obviously politics. And hello, Ricardo. Well, yes, and that's what I mean about this data point, that in some cases, data sharing may be the answer. So I have mined this vast amount of data, putting me at a competitive advantage. Well, is the answer to that to say that data has to be shared with other people? I mean, I don't know the merits of this because I'm not close enough to know the incentives in the investments and the risks and so on. But I mean, conceptually, it does make sense. A different idea that can make sense in some cases is to say that I own the data about myself, not you. And so it should be for me to be in possession of that data and then decide what is done with it. I mean, whether that can be made to work. I mean, it is very interesting to think, just as a matter of property, who owns data? And if Facebook knows all the friends I've got and the commercial websites that I look at, is that my data that I know about myself, or is it their data? I mean, different legal systems give different answers to that question, as they do to if a football match is video recorded in Old Trafford. Who owns that recording? Is it the football club whose stadium it is, or is it the two teams? Because a football game with only one team in isn't very interesting. So who owns the game? You know, there are these very strange legal questions that sometimes come up. This is Anna. Has the EC successfully blocked other 4-3 or 3-2 mergers? Since Hutchison, Telefonica? No. I'm quite simply, the answer is no. There have hardly been any prohibitions apart from anything since it, and certainly not a gap prohibition. There have been earlier cases that were gap cases, but they weren't prohibitions normally. They were cases where the Commission said there was an SIEC and then the undertakings offered remedies. So the remedy was extracted on the basis of a 4-3 gap theory of harm, but there wasn't a prohibition. And if you give remedies, that's a voluntary act on your part. So obviously you don't get appeals in those circumstances. There was a prohibition of TNT UPS, and that included a gap theory of harm, but there are also dominance issues in that case. As regards FDI, what impact risk do you see with respect to that on antitrust enforcement? Not immediately sure what you mean by that. I mean, but by all means, unmute yourself. No, what are you thinking there? This is Raphael at Kaji. Hi.
Tenta agora, Rafael, por favor.
Okay, now I think I got it. Professor, my question is whether you see any risks to put first other issues such as the foreign investment. So protecting national champions, something on this. In this line of reasoning. So putting first these issues and letting the antitrust enforcement in a secondary role.
I think you're on mute, Professor.
I absolutely understand the point now. So this is about something like, for example, Siemens Alstom a couple of years ago, where you have this merger, and it's to do with railways. And firstly, there's the very fast trains. But actually, that merger was much more about the signalling systems. Because if you're going to have trains going very fast, you have to have staggeringly sophisticated signalling systems. And here, Siemens Alstom was absolutely global leader. The Chinese could make fast trains, but they didn't make brilliant signalling systems. And the Commission says, basically, in competition terms, this is a merger to monopoly, and it prohibited it. And I think as a competition decision, that's entirely convincing. But as you know, the German and the French governments, I just realized Siemens is German and Alstom is French. Amazing coincidence. And they thought that this was a fantastic merger because it was going to make Siemens and Alstom the global leader in all of this kind of stuff, and that therefore in national champion or European champion terms, it should have been allowed, and the Commission was ridiculous, and so we've got to change the rules. Now, that is a perennial debate. And that debate was there right at the beginning of the merger regulation, when there was a case between Aerospatiale Alenia and de Havilland, which was short-range jet aircraft. And the Commission prohibited it, and the French and Italian government said, ridiculous. We should have made this company into a world champion. Now, of course, the debate goes on, and there are people around the EU who still do advance this argument. And it has to be said, the UK has now left the EU, and the UK was always probably the loudest advocate of competition law means competition law, and you exclude all of these other things. And the new UK is no longer sitting around the conference table in Brussels, and so that might change the dynamics. But I've no doubt that the Commissioner for Competition, Vestager, absolutely continues to believe that this is the right way to proceed, and that the best way to enable Siemens and Alstom to compete internationally is to go on competing domestically. And who knows, things might change, but I don't think they'll change in the short term. And I certainly don't like the idea of these kind of protectionist concepts influencing competition cases. I'm convinced that competition cases, as far as possible, should be seen as a kind of scientific exercise in defining markets, identifying market power. Let's leave it at that. If the politicians want to have an instrument that says, well, we can override that for whatever reason, well, let them do it, but it needs to be done, to my mind, it has to be done transparently, according to objective criteria, where the competition authority makes its decision, and then a minister or whoever says, well, fair enough, we understand that, but I don't have an objection to that, but I don't like it, I would say, contaminating the competition influence analysis. Okay, I think that means I have done the questions, but I'm happy to answer any others if there are any others.
Anyone? I think your mics are open now if someone wants to speak.
Daniel says, what would I change in the market definition Do you mean specifically in Siemens Alstom, or do you mean in the market definition notice? Oh, in the notice. Well, I think what the notice has to do is to just acknowledge that this is not just about the P in price. And just to say, incidentally, on that very point, that we often talk about price in competition, but in a way the word price is a sort of a portmanteau expression. When we say an increase in price, we kind of mean an increase in price, or a reduction in output, or a reduction in the quality of service, or a reduction in innovation, or conceivably less privacy. And in a way, the P, or I should do it that way around because you're looking at me, the P should be understood to include all these other, I hate the word, parameters of competition. And I think that's been part of the problem in this whole debate about consumer welfare and hipster antitrust, because an extreme version of the consumer welfare standard is that nothing matters unless you can show that price will increase. Well, that's ridiculous. If CarJ or CMA has to show that price will increase, then there's enough economists in this world to confuse everybody, and you'll never get a decision on anything. So clearly, this business isn't just about actual price increases. It's about lots of other things as well. And the notice needs to explain that. I also think that the notice has to explain how you look at these cases where the market is two-sided, multi-sided. I mean, if you're looking at MasterCard and Visa, do you say there's an issuing market and an acquiring market? Or do you just say this is payment systems? Because if it's payment systems, then MasterCard competes with cash, and I could give apples from my garden. I've got a big crop this year. I could barter. I could blah, blah, blah. So I think we need to understand better how multi-sided markets work. And we certainly need to explain about market definition for free products. And we also have to explain, how do you do market definition when we're thinking about some futuristic product that doesn't even exist? You know, how do you define a market in those circumstances? Indeed, would it be helpful to explain that there are some markets in which a traditional market definition really isn't helpful at all? When all the Uber stuff started, I mean, my God, what's the market? Is it ways of getting from Demarest's office home by taxi? Or is the market the app? What other apps? You know, I mean, you kind of think sometimes this market definition business, it's not really terribly helpful. I chaired a conference in Stockholm a couple of years ago, the Swedish authority, the pros and cons of market definition, even to the extent of debating whether market definition should be used at all. You know, Kaplow wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review saying, forget market definition, it's a waste of time. At the end of the day, we didn't think that, but we did acknowledge numerous occasions on which it's not that helpful. Okay, something else here. Yeah. Okay, well, look, it is 2 o'clock. No, it's not. It's 4 o'clock. It's whatever it is for you. 12 o'clock, isn't it? Yes. So yeah. Now you're going to have your cheese bread, and I will go and have my very late lunch.
Okay, Professor.
And Bruno, didn't he be bothered to stay? Oh, no, he did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm here. No. I don't think anyone has any other questions. So in the name of everyone that attend this classes, in the name of IBRAC, I would like to thank you again. Of course, I think I don't necessarily need to say how good this is. I mean, you understand it well. I think we all learned a lot within these 3 classes. And hopefully we can keep this partnership with you, doing this for next year and the following ones, having you here in our conference perhaps. And for the ones that still don't know the King's course, I think you still manage the online one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there is the possibility of people doing this online course at King's College, which is managed by Professor Whish. We can send further details to the ones that actually want to do that afterwards. But in the name of everyone, just thank you again, Professor. It was very great. Thank you.
Good. Very nice to see you all. And yes, see you somewhere, sometime. Okay. Bye.